All right, great. Mike, go ahead.
Cool, thanks. Hey everyone, welcome back. This is session 5 of the Azure DevOps Mini Bootcamp. Reminder in the bottom left corner of that slide, that's where the public project is if you wanted to follow along. Where we are in the agenda, we are on Azure Boards. It's been a little while since we met due to the holidays, but we're picking back up. Next week we'll be doing continuous feedback, and then our final session will probably cover the last 2 topics. Today we're doing Azure Boards. And here we are with the objectives. The highlighted in red is where we are. We're going to be managing features and bugs with Azure Boards. And the last 3 in black will be covered in our next 2 sessions. So like the previous ones, we have about 5 or 6 slides, just a quick explanation of what we'll be covering, and then we'll jump right into a demo. This probably won't be too long of one because Azure Boards is kind of straightforward once we get past all the definitions. Yeah, we're just going to jump right into it. So Azure Boards has a component called Boards, of course, and it's your Kanban board. It's an interactive signboard which provides a visual flow of work. You might have seen these types of physical boards at various offices where they have sticky notes on the wall separated by different columns like to do, doing, and done. The Kanban board is a concept that was created by Toyota in order to track some efficiencies in their operations, and we're using it as an electronic board to manage work for a team as it goes through the process. So as work progresses from an idea to completion, you kind of update the items on the boards. Goes in Azure Boards, it goes from backlog to active to resolved and then closed. Your backlog board displays stories or features, and we're going to get into what stories or features are in the next slide. Each column represents a stage, and each card, sticky note, whatever, like the screenshot on the bottom underneath all the sticky notes, those are the cards. Each card represents a backlog item, a user story, a bug, or whatever at any particular stage of work. User stories and bugs, they correspond to types of work items. We'll go over all those work items. And you use work items to share information, assign work to other team members, update the status, and track dependencies, and all sorts of things like that. So what those work items are, you can create any kind of work item that you want, but these are the default ones. You have epics, which are milestone deliveries. They're something really large that lasts for more than one sprint, and they usually contain multiple features. Epics, if you're looking at this in your Azure DevOps project, epics are not visible by default on your board, so we'll show you how to turn those on. I assume that's because, I don't know, I guess a lot of people maybe don't use epics very much. That's why it's not enabled by default. I don't know, because large things enough to be an epic may end up being their own DevOps project. And that would result in maybe one epic per project. So I think that might be why it's not enabled by default, but it's just something to be aware of. I'm not completely sold on that explanation. It's just my best guess. You could kind of maybe treat epics as we're going to deliver this solution as version 1.0, and then version 2.0 would be an epic. So it's just kind of like the overall container that houses all of those other work items that we're going to go into in a second. So then the next one would be features. This one and everything else after this is enabled by default, so you will be able to see it. Features are very much like epics. They're milestone deliveries that last larger than a sprint being a specified time-boxed period where you are expected to deliver a bunch of stories. And those stories are the time-boxed deliveries. They contain tasks. And inside those tasks are where you define everything that you're supposed to be doing. Stories, of course, have a process behind how you want them to be created. They usually follow a kind of a pattern where it says you define what the requirements are, and those requirements go in the form of, as a user/customer, I would like to be able to do whatever so that I can do this. So you kind of define who would be using that, why they need it, and what they'll be doing with it. Bugs are a potential blocker type of story or work item. that can also contain tasks. And tasks are tracked work effort for a sprint belonging to a story. So you create your story, the team accepts the story. This is during like a sprint planning meeting. And then once those stories are accepted, the tasks may not be defined, but the person who's going to be working on that story would be responsible sometimes for creating those tasks. So they take their story off the board and then they define all the things that need to be done to do that, to complete it, and there could be multiple tasks assigned to a story. So in the diagram below, you see kind of like the flow of how all these work items fit together. And issues are usually just unplanned activities, and they're tracked through queries. So you don't usually see issues on the board. So backlogs, your product backlog, it corresponds to your project plan. It's the overall roadmap for what your team plans to deliver. You create your product backlog by adding user stories and backlog items into it, and those are your requirements. After you define it, you have a prioritized list of features and requirements that you need to build. Your backlog also provides a repository of all the information you need to track and share with your team. Your backlog, it consists of all those work items that we just talked about, and you use those work items to share information and assign work to your team members. There are some best practices for backlog management. A backlog conveys customer needs and value. That's why it's important to define your user story so that the backlog or the product owner who's managing the backlog can evaluate what the next work that needs to be done is, because they'll see exactly those value statements inside of each story. The product owner is the person who interfaces between the customer and the team and is usually responsible for managing the backlog. You always want to refine your backlog. The backlog is, it tends to be, I like this word that people use sometimes, they call it your exocortex. So say you're like your external brain, somewhere where you just kind of dump things that you know need to be done, but you can't focus your attention on them right now. So people tend to they'll be working on something, they'll be like, oh, we're going to need this feature at some point. So they'll just throw it in the backlog. And if it has any value, then the person who manages the backlog will eventually assign them into the next sprint, and then someone will work on it. There's usually a meeting to refine the backlog because someone's going to be reviewing that value, and it happens usually in a separate meeting than your sprint planning meeting. The reason why I keep saying usually is because every project's a little bit different and some teams manage their backlogs differently, but overall in the Agile, Scrum, Agile methodology, this is kind of how it's defined. I will admit this isn't like my strongest point understanding the entire Agile methodology, and I'll explain that on another slide coming up when we talk about what the difference is between Agile and Scrum. But usually it's a little bit different for everyone, and it all depends on like the maturity level of the team that's using this. So sometimes you might get on a project where people haven't used this at all, and they'll just kind of figure it out as they go, and as they mature, they start using all these things, which could be another explanation of why epics, you don't see them by default, because maybe there's no reason to use them yet. Also, sorry, one other thing, capacity. We're going to be going over capacity. So on the right side there, when you have all these tasks on your board, you assign them to people and you plan the capacity of your team, because you need to figure out how much work people can do during your sprint. People say, I have 8 hours a day for 5 days, or I'm on vacation this day, and the board on the right side will keep track of how much work's assigned and what the probability of it actually being completed is. And then finally, the definition of done. So not only is it important to define your user stories with a proper description that demonstrates the value of what you're about to be creating, the definition of done is also known as the acceptance criteria. So when people are working on their work items, they know that the story is only considered complete when the acceptance criteria is met, and there's a field inside of each story where you can define what that acceptance criteria is. So for example, if you're deploying a website, you have acceptance criteria that says so-and-so tested this and signed off on it, or this feature does exactly this in this test. And that's why in another section, test plans it can kind of help with that. It can automate your acceptance. So acceptance criteria defines what is done. What done means by describing the conditions that the team should use to verify whether a requirement or bug fix has been fully implemented. And that's something that you kind of just have a discussion with your team as well. These definitions of done can vary across different teams, like all the other things that I keep saying usually on. So then the last thing, last slide, second last slide, sorry, is Agile versus Scrum. When we're going to be creating a project in Azure DevOps, you have an advanced button, I'll show that in a second as well, that says what format would you like this project to be in, and you have you have like 4 options actually, but there's 2 specific ones, Agile and Scrum. And as far as I can tell, Agile is a methodology and Scrum is a process. So I'm like, well, what is the difference between these two when you choose them in Azure DevOps? And this might be where I need to crowdsource anybody's opinion on this, but as far as I can tell, the only difference seems to be in the terminology used for the work items. So I put 2 images of each one next to each other. So top is Agile, and you'll notice that the only real differences here seem to be that in Agile, it's called a user story, and in Scrum, it's called a PBI, product backlog item. And the other one is issues, are called issues in Agile, and in Scrum, it's called an impediment. That seems to be the only thing I can find, because even when I look at the documentation on how to say create an issue or create an impediment, the documentation says how to create an issue or impediment like in the exact same sentence. So it's the way it's phrased is that these things are kind of considered the same, and it's just the terminology is different. So if anyone has any opinions on that, I'd love to know where I'm wrong in this, but this is probably the thing I spent the most time on because Azure Boards was not my strongest. And like I mentioned in the first session, this is all kind of a way to prepare and discover all of the things that Azure DevOps does in preparation for the AZ400 exam. Cool. And then the last thing we're going to go over is the Visual Studio 2019 integration. We're going to connect our Visual Studio 2019 to our Azure boards, and we'll be able to track our items and make some commits to our code that will link to those work items, and we'll be able to track all of the work that we do on boards through code. Cool, so let's jump into the demo. All right, so we're going to create an epic feature, story, and some tasks. We're going to estimate some hours for each of them and set the capacity and review our burn down. And then we're going to integrate it with VS 2019. So first off, just to get to boards, you just click over here on boards. We don't have anything in here yet. And we're going to create some new work items. We'll start with, oh, actually, I'll show you where to turn on Epic first. So when you go into your project settings, under boards project configuration, team configuration, it's right here. So you may not be able to see your epics when you're navigating through them. Cool, so let's go make an epic. All right, so the site that we've been creating over the past 4 sessions doesn't really do anything. It's kind of lame. It's the hello world when we changed like a couple of banner images to be, I don't know, like some math pictures or whatever. So we're gonna kind of define what our site should be. And in retrospect, maybe we should have had this as the first session instead of the 5th, but whatever. It's the first session that we went over was much more fun than Azure boards, so hang in there. All right, so let's figure out what we want to do with our site. Let's see. We'll say prepare. This is huge. This is something that's bigger than a single sprint. It'll have multiple features and stories. So we'll say prepare. This will just be to prepare the website for production. We'll only be typing a couple of these, so hang in there. And just to be complete, we'll put some descriptions in. All of the stories needed to move site to production. All right. That was exciting, wasn't it? All right, so now we're going to put all the other work items into our epic. Next, we're going to go on to a feature. Make feature here and say make the site functional. The site, it really doesn't do anything, so make it more useful. All right, so how do we get that feature into the epic? In the bottom right, we have related work. We'll click on add link, choose an existing item, and we should see our epic here somewhere. Here we go. Great. Let's see how that looks. Oops. Gotta save it. All right. Just moving down the list. So you notice here it says issue. This is one of those Agile versus Scrum settings. If we were in the other, it would say impediment here. And the form generally looks the same. I think there might be a few different fields inside of it when you create it, but I'm pretty sure they're really close to being the same. So we got our features, and what goes into features? Stories. This is where we have the acceptance criteria. So what's our story going to be? Let's see, we want to decide what the site is going to do. And our acceptance criteria is deliver a POC of a functional site. And we're going to link this one as well. We'll link it to the feature this time. Great. Okay, almost done entering all these. So now we're at the point where, let's say we're in a sprint planning meeting. I mean, we don't have a lot of examples here, but the sprint planning meeting decides that we're going to focus on this story for the sprint, deciding what the site's going to do. The team that's involved in that meeting, they accept that as their work for the sprint, and they now have to decide what those tasks are. So it could be a bunch of people that need to do a whole bunch of different things to make this story be successful. So what you can do is the team then takes this away and they start making tasks. But going into new work item and task is a little bit tedious. So instead, what we're going to do is jump over to boards. And now we have that display of all the columns for the Kanban board. And I'm just going to be the only person on this team, of course, so we can add tasks here. So what are the tasks that we need to do to decide what the site is going to do? We need to conduct a brainstorming meeting. We need to, let's say we have an idea of what it is. We just had our brainstorming meeting. We're going to change the site to show a picture of a cat because that's better than a picture of math, I guess. And then we know that we also want to change the site to show a picture of a random cat each time it gets refreshed. So the reason why I'm doing this is separating each one of these things is because the whole goal of it is to deliver little pieces at a time. So if we were to be tracking this through code, each one of these things, as we close them, will have a commit in our repo where we can track exact changes and where they relate back to the tasks that were assigned to the story. And then maybe we'll say we decided that we also wanted to display cat facts. Cool. All right, so we have this. Let's take a look at those tasks that we created. So we got a bunch of new little options here. We have effort in hours, and you see that they're already linked there because we were doing it from the boards. So let's estimate how long it's going to take these. I'm just going to say everything is going to take me 4 hours. We'll go through each one of these and set it to 4. And the reason why we're doing this is because on that slide where we saw everyone's availability for the sprint, this is where it gets that information. You can also classify it as different activities. Just for the sake of doing it, we'll say this is a development task.
Can I
And
ask
one
a
more to
question
go.
here?
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, when we put effort, right, we put estimate like original estimate and remaining. Let's say on this task, we have spent like 2 hours. And when we come back to this task, do we need to adjust both remaining and completed? We finished 2 hours completed and remaining is still 2 hours. Or we only touch completed option?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you have to change both because it's not, unless there is a way that I'm not aware of, it seems that you have to kind of calculate this on your own. So the question is, if I was working on a specific task and I had to change the site to show a picture of a cat and I already spent 2 hours on it, if I hit 2 here and I estimated 4, is it going to adjust? No, because I think the idea behind it is you're estimating. So you're not going to be exact all the time. So the way I do it anyway is I go back in here and I say, now there's 2 hours remaining. All right.
And do we have any like Power BI report or Azure boards can tell that, hey, we have a task or a user story, which is like 12 hours estimated, and we spent like 5 hours, remaining is 7 hours. And do we have a place where we can see like a one view on this user story effort?
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time? Because I think the answer to see what the overall effort is of it is by looking at the task
correct.
itself.
Yes, correct. So basically, let's say this user story is like 5 tasks, okay? Each task has a different estimated hours as well as the completed hours and pending hours. Instead of going each and every task, and also I think on top of user story, we may have seen the number of hours still left, which needs to be put in to complete this user story. What I'm asking is to see this, do we have any like a Power BI dashboard extension for this to take a look at it, how many hours spent, how many hours still remaining, and are we at a risk to complete this user story, etc.
Oh yeah, across like all tasks.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's under the query section. So right here, you can make a new query and kind of build it out. Work item type is, let's see, probably task here. Yep. And state is open, or we'll say not closed. Sorry, I'm kind of doing this on the fly, but I'm assuming this would be like all the work item types that are not closed, and then you can choose which columns that you want and run the query. And so we would add those columns. Let's see if we can select them here. There's probably like estimated time, maybe. remaining time, remaining work. Yep, so just kind of like that. And you can, I'm sure, integrate this somehow with Power BI. You can connect it to Excel. I know that for sure. Claudia and I have been working on something in Excel like this for a little while. So, I mean, that's one way of doing it. I don't know if there's any like visual reports that you can do from this.
Yeah, I think you can do an overview. You can create a board over here on the overview.
Oh, the dashboards, yeah.
Dashboard, yes.
Yeah.
And
Let's
it's
see.
called
Maybe it's this one. Let's see.
Yeah, sorry to sidetrack. Just wanted to
No,
make sure
that's
that
okay.
that's a
we
good
are on
There's-
topic. I thought of putting it.
Don't worry about it, dude. There's so not a lot to Azure boards that I have to cover here, so this is good. Let's see. Chart for work items. This looks cool. Oh yeah, and if I would have saved that query, it probably would have showed up right there. Yeah, so cool. Thanks, Claudia. Okay, so we have all these. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I have another question for. So let's say we have budgeted fixed hours for Epic, and then for feature, etc. And then will it be calculated according to the tasks that you actually according to the task that you assigned and hours that you estimated?
I believe it only works against tasks because as we look at this example of the Epic here, we have effort, but effort isn't necessarily something that is hours.
Mm-hmm.
Effort is like another definite, it's kind of like that definition of done where your team decides. So some people will decide that effort is a number that's based on how many days the entire epic will be needed to be completed. So there won't be a calculation on this in hours. It'll be mainly in effort. And let's see where else hours shows up. So under the feature, again, there's no hours.
Mm-hmm.
And story, I'm not sure. No hours for story as well. I mean, you could add another field. It's very customizable, and you could add a field for hours, but by default, I don't see any calculations for hours based on anything other than tasks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Cool. So let's jump into our tasks again. And we have iterations, which is the default naming for a sprint. We'll assign these to iteration 1. And after this, we're going to set up our iteration or sprint. We're going to get all this stuff done in the first sprint. And the last one. I think that covers that. Okay, so now let's go to sprint. Now that we have some stuff assigned to it, let's see what shows up when we look at our sprint. There we go. There they all are. All these new tasks, they're unassigned, the story that it's assigned to, and iteration 1. But we see up here, we don't have any dates set yet. So we're going to set the date for our iteration to be just this week. And now if we refresh, we should see a little chart. There we go. Usually the chart's you want to see it going in the other direction. You don't typically add tasks to your sprint or to the middle of your sprint, and this is considered your burn down. So as you start closing tasks the next day, you should see this chart actually going in the other direction, and your goal, of course, is to have it at the bottom line by the end of the sprint. So let's take a look at capacity. That was this screen here. So how do we get this? It gets this information from all those time estimates that we were just putting in there. And we have this capacity tab on our sprint where we get to specify how many hours each person has to work on their tasks. So I'm going to say that I'm off for the 5 days. So we have, what was it, 16 hours, and I am only available for 8 of those. So it's a good way to track what, the capacity of your overall team, but we only have one person here. So let's assign them to me and see what happens. So under work details, oh, that's where I chose that development activity and the rest are left as unsigned. Awesome. All right, so as we work through these, it's just a matter of dragging them. We can just drag them to active so that the product owner can take a quick glance at what's going on in the project. You'll notice that we can't drag these to resolved. And the reason for that is because resolved is reserved for bugs. So we'll make a bug. And we should be able to slide it there. There we go. The reason why we want resolved versus closed for bugs is because when someone resolves a bug, there's usually someone who needs to confirm that the bug is resolved, and once it is, they can drag it to closed. I think, let's see, what else do we have before we move on to integrating with Visual Studio? I think that might be pretty much it for that, but just hang in there one sec. I want to confirm one other thing. Closed. Awesome. Okay, so we conducted our brainstorming meeting, and now we want to change our site to show a picture of a cat. Great. So let's find a picture of a cat. Which one do we want? I found one earlier. Let's go with this one. It looks beautiful. So we'll save this image. Awesome. And now, since we had our repo, it was cloned in VS Code, but I want to use Visual Studio 2019 now. And the reason why I want to do that is because it has a new feature that integrates with your work items. So we hit clone of Visual Studio. I have 2017 and 2019 installed, so that's why I have this pop up, but cool.
So what is that new feature?
This new feature is this. So here's our clone project in Visual Studio 2019. If we go over to Team Explorer and then to work items, sorry, work items, yeah, sorry. Here's our work items, the tasks that we entered in before. And notice it doesn't show the one that's closed, and it just keeps an updated view. So completed, we should see conduct a brainstorming meeting, and that one's hover our mouse over it, and it shows us that it's closed. So that's kind of cool. So we don't have to jump back to the web browser to take care of that. So we're going to work on, which one should we work on? We'll change the site to show a picture of a cat. Great. Downloads. Take this picture. And we'll put it into the place where we cloned it. Where was was it this? And then my web app, and here we go. So it's called kittyshake.jpg. Great. We'll jump over to the code editor, and we're going to change our site, which is under pages, index.cs HTML. And we'll just change this to, what was it? JPEG. Great. Save it. Let's take this to hide the completed ones. And so what we're working on is work item 471. Back in Team Explorer, when you see your changes now, you can type in #471 and it sees the link to those work items. That way you don't have to, really think about your commits. You can just kind of say what exactly you're working on.
Mike, is it possible to make a larger font on the right
Oh, yeah. I don't know about the right
of a
side.
Team Explorer, or maybe change the theme because I can barely see.
Yeah, I don't know if you can change this one. Yeah, sorry. I'm not sure how to change the right side of it, but maybe I have...
Maybe you can change the default theme to Visual Studio, lighter one.
Yeah, okay. So you want me to change the theme in Visual Studio? Sure. Where would that be? Oh, right there. Okay, so
I think it's better.
Okay, great. So what I did was under Team Explorer, just like in VS Code, it keeps track of our changes, and when we commit them, instead of typing in whatever the description was, we can also link it to our work item, which you just type. Now that it's linked, when we saw it on that other tab, I'll go back to that in a second, but when you hit #, it shows all those work items that are connected to the project. And just to review that again for anyone who couldn't see it, under the Team Explorer and work items is where you see a list of all those work items that we just created. And this is that feature in 2019. So if this were to deploy and now our site shows a picture of a cat and we think it's okay, we can also right click on it and say that the work item is completed. So let's take a look at what that looks like back in the browser. And this should, did I do that one? 471? No, I didn't. Yeah, I did 4. Yeah, all right. I chose the wrong one, but whatever. Huh. Okay, let's take a look at our board. We should see 471 on our sprint board. 471 is over here. It's closed now because I closed it in Visual Studio. And when I click on the task, we see development work, and it's related here, and it gives you the commit number. So you can go to your code and see exactly what was changed. So I don't know, that was my favorite part about going through what Azure boards can do for us, is this new feature. I mean, this tracking the commit and all that stuff that always did it. You could always, if you're using 2017, you can still put # and then the number, but that integration with the work items is a new feature. So let's see. I haven't looked at that site in a while. I'm not even sure if it still builds and releases. So in our previous sessions, we created a CI/CD pipeline. I've deleted it a whole bunch of times, so I'm not even sure what its state is right now. And it's deploying to production. I wasn't really planning on showing that image actually get deployed, but whatever. I'm at the end of it and we only have a few more minutes left. Right, well, I'll let that go. But while that's going, let's see what else there was. We integrated, estimate the hours, set the capacity. We got our burn down. I'm pretty sure this is going to fail deployment, but because the last one did. But yeah, that's pretty much it for Azure Boards. Does anyone have any questions that they want me to look into? And I hope maybe someone who can explain the difference between Agile and Scrum. I'll show you where that setting is. When you create a new project, under Advanced here, it's your work item process. This and this, Agile and Scrum, is where I'm like kind of looking for a better explanation than what I gave. I did, however, include in the notes Scrum versus Agile in Azure DevOps, because there is a table on the doc site. For all of those that are there. And again, it's just like that image that I had on the slide. The difference between Agile and Scrum here is it just looks like the terminology is different. There's equal number of items, just different names. So anyway, when we do the homework for next week, if I find a better answer, I will let you know. But the homework there's not really a lot to do. Azure Boards is what it is. If you want, create your own work items for your project, or just a reminder, you can use the Azure DevOps demo generator and you can work with some samples there. And a bunch of references for the details about work items, boards, backlogs, definition of done or acceptance criteria, that comparison of Scrum and Agile and AZDO, and a link to the bootcamp project. I'll post this in the team site in a few minutes. Anyone have any questions? Cool. All right. So next session is next session is homework, but the actual next bootcamp session is probably going to be a test plan. So that should be pretty cool. Hope to see everyone there.
Thank you so much, Mike. Let me stop the recording.